On the night I signed away my crown, someone tried to sign my death warrant into my champagne. I had sold the company I'd built from a single wrench and a stubborn plan for $68 million, and the house was full of people who smiled the way professional mourners smile, with practiced sympathy. At 75, I still noticed small tells. The way a hand lingered too long near the hors d'oeuvres, the hitch in a laugh, the way eyes catalogued silverware as if counting an inheritance already won. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're hearing my revenge story from. I want to know how far it's reached. My name is Gabriel Winston, a 75-year-old retired oil tycoon. My retirement party was meant to be an elegy and celebration. Marble floors reflected a brass quartet, waiters circulated with plates, and 40 flutes of my signature champagne glinted like tiny trophies. I kept things precise my whole life. A private chef, cameras where they would not offend, and a rule about my drink. After what had happened years earlier, I rarely trusted a poured glass. I did not make a scene that night. I watched. Davis, my son, gave the little speech sons give when they expect to inherit more than a name. He smiled at every pause, waiting for a nod that would become permission. His wife, Lauren, moved with a confidence that had been practiced. She hovered at the drinks table, opened a folded paper and pinched a pale dust. With the calm of someone used to passing bad contracts around a boardroom table, she eased the powder into the flute at the rim. Most guests missed it. People mingle on scripts at parties. I did not. I lifted my glass and met Lauren's eyes. She smiled as if she had already won. "You've earned it," I said, "because some truths are best tested inside a lie." Then, in a movement so small it could be overlooked, I slid my flute and took the one beside Julian, Lauren's mother, who had been sitting calmly by the window. The switch was deliberate. I set the toasted glass down and watched. Julian's collapse was a bad cue in a play. She convulsed, foam at her mouth, her color draining until she looked the precise shade of old bone. Guests reacted as guests always do. Some reached, some stepped back, and the brass quartet fell silent. Paramedics came and the ambulance left in a sequence I had seen on other nights when deals turned toxic. The exhilaration of the sale evaporated into a chill that smelled faintly of antiseptic and old paper. I remember thinking then, not in panic but in accounting terms. Identify motive, preserve evidence, secure witnesses. I insisted on going to Blue Sea Medical Center with Julian even as Davis urged me to stay and clean up. He did not mean tidy. He meant to tidy my life into something he could own. I refused. "No," I told him. "I'm coming. If anyone is going to say anything about that glass, I intend to be there." The hospital was efficient in ways memory rarely is. Nurses with clipped hair asked questions that were less curious than mechanical. Tests were run. Doctors moved like chess players. The word cyanide arrived in a phone call hours later, a precise, awful word that framed the night in a way nothing else could. Lauren's panic had a practiced edge. Davis's jaw tightened when his phone vibrated. I watched them as if reading a balance sheet. There was a chipped rim on one flute, my signature glass, the one the chef knew to set aside for me because it fit my hand, because its fault was a memory. Small marks matter to men who make and unmake fortunes. They are the only honest ledger. When Lauren reached for that flute, the chipped edge flashed in the candlelight and something in me tightened. Old lessons whisper, notice the smallest deviation. I had learned to watch those deviations like a trader watches a ticker. That night became the first page of an investigation. Standing in a room full of family, I felt the acute oddness of knowing a betrayal had occurred among people who called themselves mine. It was never only about money. Although money was the engine that drove most betrayals, it was about control. Greed, I thought, never announces itself politely. It waits until you blink. They wheeled Julian into the emergency room and the room's bright antiseptic light made everything honest. The hose of my celebration turned into a stream of fluorescent efficiency. Nurses with quick hands, a captain of physicians who asked concise questions, and a ledger of vitals printed in black. Lauren's distress played in beats I had learned to read. The exact moment her hand covered her mouth, the manufactured tremor on her lower lip. Davis kept checking his phone, not slumping with grief but waiting for an answer. I cataloged those movements as if they were line items on a balance sheet, a habit that had kept my businesses alive. The doctors drew blood and ordered panels. They labeled tubes with neat block letters and slid samples toward the centrifuge as if performing arithmetic on mortality. When the lab called with the name I feared, the room tightened around me. Sodium cyanide. It was the kind of word that simplifies complexity into a legal lever. Cyanide is efficient. It does the job without drama. The tests read like a forensic ledger. I called George Alwell immediately. "Preserve everything," he said. "Chain of custody is everything. Don't make statements." His voice had the practiced cadence of a man who had seen families unravel and legal narratives twist. That night I learned to value restraint as much as fury. Accusations without documented facts invite countersuit and chaos. There were small, verifiable things that would become important. The chipped rim on a single flute, the folded paper Lauren had used, the chef's inventory and logs, the house cameras. I asked the hospital staff to lock and log Julian's samples and to give me the chain of custody paperwork. The receptionist handed me a slip and the weight of that sheet felt like a thin shield around the truth. Back at the estate, guests murmured and made their exits. Davis suggested we handle this privately, which in his vocabulary meant contain and control the narrative. I refused. Being absent from the scene would have allowed rearrangements. Presence preserves provenance. So I stayed with Julian's chart in my lap, making quiet notes. The paramedic's name, the time the ambulance left, the model of the vehicle that had carried her. I thought about motive in terms of cold arithmetic. Months earlier Lauren had taken out a $1 million life insurance policy on me. She declared insurable interest as a caregiver. That line on a policy is a ledger entry that changes the arithmetic of a family gathering. It does not prove malice, but it frames motive on paper and gives anyone who studies ledgers a reason to look closer. At 2 a.m, Lauren paced the hospital corridor like an actress on a long call. Her phone vibrated with messages she excised in small, frantic gestures. Davis watched with a face that toggled between blank sorrow and sharp calculation. People under pressure reveal their edges. A man who had worked municipal hours in my town sat quietly and asked direct questions. He trusted professionals. I reported the specifics to George, and he advised patience and documentation. I also thought about the optics and the press. A headline about a poisoned guest at a retirement party could become a caricature before any fact-finding had occurred. George cautioned against comment. "Let prosecutors make the case," he said. "Soundbites are dangerous." So we sealed initial statements and focused on the verifiable. The glass, the guest list, the cameras, the chef's reports. Some of the first evidence was mundane but crucial. A flute with a chipped rim can be traced back to the serving table. A folded piece of paper with residue can be chemically tested. A deleted message can be reconstructed if you have the right subpoenas. The early hours are where mistakes happen. People delete and dispose and try to tidy the scene. I did not want tidy. I wanted truth. I had spent 75 years on this earth. I did not survive hostile deals by being stupid. That memory, of a life that demanded patience, sat with me. I would deploy patience now. Call a private investigator, keep counsel, and let the facts accumulate like compound interest. Greed reveals itself in ledgers and late-night messages. We would follow both and carefully. Loretta Brown had been my partner before she became my problem. We loved with the kind of intensity that builds empires and then sometimes corrodes them. In the quiet of our years together I noticed small things. A shifted jar, a faint chemical aftertaste in a tea. Details I might have dismissed if not for the expertise of survival I had honed in business. I confronted Loretta once about those oddities. She answered with explanations that sounded like apologies. Later, the apologies frayed. The attempt was not dramatic. It was a domestic erosion, a mislaid bottle, a flavor altered, a glass that tasted metallic in a way the tongue remembers. You cannot always point to melodrama in these cases. Often the poison is quiet and the intent is quieter still. When I understood what had happened, I chose separation. We divorced not with fury but with a series of cool, deliberate decisions that split routines and accounts. Years later Loretta died of ovarian cancer. I saw her before she died and forgave her. Not because forgiveness absolved the danger she had posed, but because carrying malice felt like succumbing to the same burden that shattered us. Forgiveness for me was an arithmetic of mercy, not a return to naivete. My forgiveness did not translate into lowered defenses. If anything, it reinforced them. From that history came rules. I insisted on a private chef rather than a rotating caterer. I kept cameras in rooms that would not offend guests but would record small movements. I adopted a single, chipped flute for moments I wanted to mark as mine. Those precautions were the practical legacy of a personal betrayal. You guard what matters, not from strangers but from familiar hands. My response was structural. I organized accounts into vehicles that made it difficult for an opportunistic relative to seize control. I consulted attorneys as one consults maps. Over time, I cultivated a few trusted professionals. A lawyer, an investigator, a careful manager of the house, and paid them better than etiquette ever required. I moved wealth into arrangements that required paperwork, witnesses, and a slow unpicking that a greedy hand would not have patience to enact. People often mistake caution for bitterness. They call men who protect themselves cynical. But there is a moral difference between cynicism and learned defense. The first assumes the worst and freezes. The second prepares for it without surrendering to it. I chose defense. I kept my life marked with small rituals that made it hard for malice to slip unnoticed. Labeled bottles, signed inventories, a known glass with a fault that only a careful eye would spot. These were not theatrics. They were simple arithmetic. Document, photograph, witness. If a family meeting could be turned into ledger entries, then a ledger should also be able to expose the meeting. So when Lauren reached for my chipped flute the night of the party, the gesture resonated with histories I had catalogued. The minute deviation, a finger closing around a particular rim, signaled a choice. I reacted with procedure rather than accusation. Forgiveness had bought me private peace. Caution bought me public safety. I forgave Loretta in the solitude of a hospice room and then returned to the work of fortifying my life. I kept my independence as one keeps a flame under a glass. Protected, tended, and intentionally separate from careless hands. That separation meant I could love without losing myself to expectation. I converted emotion into systems. Trusts, surveillance, a private chef, a marked glass, and counsel whose job was evidence over sentiment. I had given money when asked and when needed, but I resisted converting gifts into entitlement. That is why, rather than pass a company into a hand I did not trust, I chose to sell. The sale preserved my independence but seeded anger. Forgiveness did not erase the wounds, it only clarified that my priority was autonomy. Prevention, not vengeance, became the watchword. Protection takes patience, paperwork, and the humility to follow sensible counsel at the cost of personal comfort. Those systems turned memory into strategy and made me difficult to surprise when people moved toward theft and detection. Family is where the most dangerous currency circulates. Love exchanged for expectation. Davis had grown up believing my work would become his. He was affable in company and entitled in private, the kind of man who assumed succession was a birthright. Jeremy, my younger son, lived away from our household's politics. He kept a steady distance and a steadier job. He was never the one to covet what he did not earn. I gave help, down payments, tuition, emergency cash, because that is what a father does. Over 5 years those gifts amounted to about $500,000. I did not keep a ledger to punish. I gave because my appetite for family included support. But gifts are not promises. I never signed an agreement that my children's needs would become my estate's duty. When I decided not to pass the company to Davis and instead to sell, resentment hardened like frost. He had once joked openly that the firm would be his. He had told friends he expected to take my desk and my keys. "It's always been yours," he said to me once, as if lineage conferred ownership. I told him plainly, no, that refusal was not cruelty. It was a boundary. Lauren fit the pattern that can infect families. Warmth that masks calculation. Her jewelry venture produced little. Her consulting work floundered. Creditors crept close. In the months before the sale there were thin, alarming lines on financial statements. Max cards, a mortgaged house, and wobbling business ledgers. Those details are not excuses. but they explain the pressure that warps judgment. You do not see entitlement grow overnight. It accrues like compound interest, favors repeated without expectation, loans given without conditions, and the slow belief that generosity is inheritance. When generosity becomes expectation, the dynamic in a home changes. People start to measure their worth against a parent's assets instead of their own efforts. What I learned over decades of business is that wealth requires clear fences. I structured accounts and trusts in ways that made quick transfer difficult. I consulted with George and kept my assets in vehicles that required witness and paperwork. Those measures were not about withholding kindness. They were about protecting independence. The difference matters. Davis once stormed out when I refused him a seat in management. He called my decision cold. I called it necessary. We argued in old ways. He accused, I tried to explain. My explanations were technical and boring to someone who wanted legacy without labor. We had moments of genuine father and son warmth, tinkering with radios when he was small, teaching him to change an oil filter, but those memories did not convert into entitlement. The fracture grew because entitlement met opportunity. A man who believes in inevitable succession can begin to rationalize leverage as legitimate. Private conversations, hurried texts, questions about wills become the early signs. I noticed small shifts. Davis soft in public and sharp when counting dollars. Lauren asking casual questions about wills that sounded like strategy. My caution increased, and my willingness to be generous decreased. It is a terrible thing to protect yourself against your child. There is a moral ache to it. I mourned the loss of intimacy even as I indexed the dangers. The ledger of affection sits beside legal counsel in a life of contradictions. I did not want war. I wanted boundaries that could not be crossed on a whim. Years later, when I asked Ryan to map their finances, the numbers made resentment legible. $170,000 in credit card debt, a mortgaged house with payments outpacing income, and a string of failed businesses. The $500,000 in gifts I had given looked on a worksheet like down payments against a future inheritance. These cold arithmetic facts explained why people will cross lines when desperation meets perceived right. They reveal how greed recalibrates moral lines into transaction lines, where family becomes balance and affection becomes leverage. Our family's fracture was not born the night Julian collapsed. It had been building for years in small transactions and unmet expectations. The night of the party made private math public. The architecture of entitlement, debts, expectations, and the sense of inherited right would later be the text of the prosecution. For now, in the quiet before evidence, I felt the weight of choices that once seemed simply prudent and now had ripened into reasons for betrayal. Greed is a patient thing. It does not always scream. Often it arranges itself in thin, precise moves until the whole strategy reads as inevitability. When Julian's poisoning planted the first physical evidence before me, I began to look for the arithmetic behind the impulse. I hired Ryan Babel, a private investigator whose patience matched mine. Ryan pulled bank statements and tax forms and began to draw lines between payments and promises. What he found was not a single desperate act but a pattern. A failing consulting firm that had burned through cash, a jewelry business with inventory that would not sell, and a mortgaged house with payments that ate at whatever small income the couple had. Creditors had amassed about $170,000 in unsecured debt that strained their monthly finances. The $500,000 I had lent and gifted across 5 years, down payments, tuition, emergency loans, looked on paper like installments of future entitlement. You can give with an open heart, but a ledger will often record intent differently. Those numbers made motive legible in a way sentiment never could. Ryan found something else that tightened the knot. A $1 million life insurance policy on me that Lauren had arranged, listing insurable interest as caregiver. It is an odd phrase to see in the handwriting of a family member who was not, on file, my formal caregiver. Insurance is the arithmetic of risk and interest. Someone had calculated theirs in a way that assumed benefit from my death or incapacitation. Even more disturbing were payments to a Dr. Desmond Hinges, a psychiatrist with a reputation for convenient evaluations. Ryan found invoices and quick notes that suggested an attempt to create a narrative about cognitive decline. The plan seemed to be, dose a drink, create an incident, use a supposed decline to push for guardianship, and then funnel control through paper channels and the insurance payout. Brookville Homes emerged in messages as the destination, an upscale facility demanding a $600,000 entry. If I were portrayed as incompetent and required a transfer of assets to cover care, the path from guardianship to asset redirection became disturbingly logical. Guardianship is a legal instrument that can reshape control with terrifying efficiency when wielded by those who understand both law and greed. Then there was Joel Albert, a director at the firm whose anger at the sale had been palpable. Ryan retrieved transfers and correspondence that showed payments to Joel from shell accounts and notes that suggested collusion. Joel's resentment had not merely been about losing influence. It had been about losing the steady extortion he practiced in the company's margins. If I sold the firm, he could lose both status and the underground revenue that fed him. This was not a plot hatched in a single conversation. It was an architecture, debts and policy, a director with motive, a psychiatrist with a pliant pen, and a family that had normalized thinking of wealth in entitlement terms. Motive and means intersected and formed a plan that looked frighteningly executable. I did not rush to expose them. I built a counter-strategy with George and Ryan. George rewrote estate structures into layered trusts that would place the $68 million beyond easy seizure. He drafted contingency clauses that rerouted assets to charities should a suspicious guardianship arise. He also created a baited power of attorney, a document that looked real but granted only nominal access, hoping to draw the conspirators into a revealing act. We documented everything. Security footage, chef logs, messages recovered by Ryan, payments to Dr. Hinges and Joel's suspicious transfers formed a web that would hold in court if we preserved the chain of custody. I insisted on the letter of proof rather than the theatrics of accusation. Evidence would be the language in which justice spoke. This is also where betrayal and strategy diverge into moral complexities. I had helped Davis and Lauren when they were down. I had believed, in some small, stubborn way, that family is not just a contract. That belief made their potential treachery a sharper wound. But justice is not personal revenge. It is a public accounting. I wanted the truth to prevail, not simply to punish. Ryan's final report read like a cold audit. Dates, amounts, logs, and a timeline. It showed the policy, the payments to the psychiatrist, Joel's transfers, the credit card debt, and the mortgage. It revealed a motive nourished by desperation and entitlement. With that report in hand, George prepared the legal scaffolding we would need. The arithmetic of greed had become visible. Greed records itself in ledgers and late-night arrangements. It leaves traces. My work was to follow those traces patiently, to translate resentment and desperation into evidence, and to ensure control of my life remained mine, and carefully. I held her hand like a man who understands the value of a witness. Julian arrived 3 days after the hospital discharge, wrapped in a cardigan the color of old tea. She walked into my parlor and sat where the cameras could see without feeling intrusive. Her first sentence was simple and fatal. "She tried to kill you, Gabriel." That confession hit with the gravity of a verdict. Her memory of the night was uncanny in its precision. "It tasted bitter," she said, twisting a tissue. She pinched a powder from a folded paper and let it fall. Julian described the folded rectangle, the kind a pharmacist might use, and the way Lauren's hand lingered near my signature flute with its chipped rim. Her detail matched what I had seen. Corroboration matters. Two testimonies that converge create momentum. Julian had no financial stake in my company. Her motive was not money but maternal horror. "I don't want his fortune," she insisted. "I want him alive." Her simplicity became our moral lever. An in-law's alarm reframes betrayal. It refuses the private family script and insists on public accountability. We formed a quiet pact. Julian would testify to what she remembered and help reconstruct the moments around the drinks table. I would hire experts and ensure evidence was preserved. We agreed on discretion because the press devours facts and leaves rumor. Sensationalism would only muddy the legal waters. Her recall-supplied texture cameras could not. Taste, hesitation, the microsignal of a practiced performance. CCTV might show hands, but human testimony supplies motive's tone. Jurors respond to the way a moment felt as much as to its mechanics. Julian's voice would translate the freezing of a face and the metallic hint on a tongue into narrative. She also remembered small, practical details that guided the investigation. Which waiter set the tray near her seat, the arrangement of flutes on the serving cart, and the moment a chef turned to attend to a garnish. Those pinpoints allowed Ryan to interview staff with purpose and gave the evidence chain shape. Her involvement altered the family's emotional arithmetic. When a conspirator's parent accuses the conspirator, the moral calculus shifts. It is harder to write off poisoning as family drama when a mother says she nearly died at her daughter's hands. That shift was crucial for public perception and prosecutorial interest. We cataloged hospital records, preserved sample custody slips, photographed the folded paper prototype she described, and sealed it for later comparison with lab residue. We documented who touched which flute and when, and listed witnesses prioritized for corroboration. Julian's presence lessened the solitude of betrayal. I had survived business betrayals, but family treachery carries a particular ache. Having an ally who had been nearly sacrificed centered the campaign not on retribution but on showing how greed seeks to cannibalize kin. Julian and I spoke often after that meeting, mapping timelines and naming what each of us saw as essential. The poison, the motive, and the strings that tied money to intention. She had seen Lauren ask casual questions about wills and Brookville homes, the $600,000 gate that would strip independence. Inheritance and control hovered like ghosts. This was not mere family drama. It was a blueprint of greed aimed at seizing both fortune and autonomy. On a practical level, Julian helped protect the grandchildren from exposure. She insisted on quiet arrangements for Amy and Rain, urging that the case unfold without sensational media so the girls could continue schooling with less intrusion. Her maternal instinct extended beyond outrage. It planned for fallout. When Julian left my study, she squeezed my hand and said, "We will make them own it." There was no triumph in her voice, only a tired hope. Betrayal, when witnessed and documented, becomes less invisible and less likely to be repeated. Our alliance was the hinge upon which private pain might swing into public accountability, and for the first time since the ambulance left, I felt less alone in preparing for what justice would require and measured resolve. I rebuilt my safety like an architect who refuses collapse. After Julian's testimony and the lab reports gained traction, I sat with George Alwell in his book-lined office while he sketched the legal scaffolding to protect me from guardianship and theft. George had been my counsel for 30 years. He spoke in contingencies. The word trust felt both legal and sacred. We needed structures that made sudden transfer impossible and guardianship claims hollow. George rewrote the estate into layered irrevocable trusts with gatekeepers and thresholds. The $68 million would be parceled and time-locked, accessible only through conditions requiring oversight. He built clauses to reroute funds to charities if any seizure attempt looked fraudulent. Those contingencies would become a legal moat. He also proposed bait, a power of attorney that looked authentic but granted nominal access, a decoy to draw conspirators into use and therefore expose themselves. He set nominal account access at $1,000. The paper would appear to give control while the true assets remained behind multiple legal walls. Competency would be the next battleground. The conspirators had paid Dr. Desmond Hinges for convenient evaluations. George advised proactive documentation, a voluntary, independent competency evaluation by a reputable neurologist whose findings would be public record. If they sought guardianship, we would have a counter-report showing lucidity. Chain of custody and evidence preservation became central. George insisted Ryan secure chef logs, camera footage, guest lists, and physical residue. Legal fights get lost in sloppy handling, he said. Proof is about logistics. A single missed signature on a custody sheet can let evidence be excluded. Practical security followed. I had additional cameras and motion sensors installed not out of paranoia but to document. Extra footage would provide secondary perspectives on hands and timing at the drinks table. A silent panic protocol was put in place should any guest behave suspiciously. We discussed communication. George warned against public declarations. Let prosecutors and the lab speak, he advised. Talk becomes liability. We limited statements and focused on preserving the paper trail. Presence and paperwork, not press, would be our tools. Financially, We created revocable educational trusts for Amy and Rain to shield the grandchildren and signal that children would not be punished for adults' mistakes. The bulk of the sale was fortified behind trustee requirements, oversight committees, and custodial arrangements that complicated any quick grasping. George added more layers: spendthrift provisions, a trustee committee that included an external fiduciary, staggered distributions requiring milestones, clawback clauses, and audit triggers. These mechanisms turned a tempting single ledger into a series of puzzles a grasping hand could not solve quickly. We also upgraded physical security, redundant camera angles, locked cabinets for important items, and a verified chain of custody protocol. These measures protected independence and dignity. Implementing the trusts took meticulous work. George prepared decoy documents with signatures matching my cursive. Paralegals drafted trust language and coordinated with custodians to complicate unauthorized transfers. The strategy required time and money to build, both things I had in preference to desperation. On the day the trusts were executed, I left George's office feeling less exposed. The rawness of betrayal remained, but the architecture of protection brought clarity. The fights ahead would be fought by documents and depositions more than by emotional pronouncement. That suited me. I preferred systems to spectacles. I called Ryan. "Any updates?" I asked. He replied, "Yes. Patterns forming. Greed weaves itself into ledgers. So do defenses." We had begun ensuring that what I built could not be casually appropriated by those who mistook affection for right. Fine patience catches greedy hands. Ryan Babel arrived in a rumpled suit and a measured temper, the kind of private investigator who can sit in a diner booth for 8 hours to watch a pattern form. He presented a thick packet of bank statements, tax printouts, screenshots, and a timeline that read less like accusation and more like the slow accrual of evidence. The numbers were sharp: transfers to shell accounts, payments to Dr. Desmond Hinges for quick psychiatric notes, and recurring disbursements tracing to Joel Albert's accounts. Ryan laid out dates when Lauren moved money and withdrawals that aligned with urgent bills. The failing consulting firm's payroll gaps and the jewelry business's inventory write-offs completed the picture. Motive became material. He had recovered deleted messages. Notes between Davis and Lauren referenced "tomorrow night," "make sure it's quiet," and questions about Brookville Homes fee. He also found an insurance application for $1 million that Lauren filed, listing insurable interest as caregiver. On paper it read legitimate. In context it read like incentive. Joel's involvement showed in emails lobbying me to keep the company and in obscure transfers from shell accounts. His fear of exposure if the sale proceeded suggested motive beyond pride, losing both status and illicit revenue. Payments to Joel matched dates when suspicious transfers were made. Dr. Hinge's invoices were terse, with payments routed through third parties. Ryan found receipts that matched cash withdrawals and payments suggesting purchased medical narratives about cognitive decline. A manufactured psychiatric opinion can be devastating when used to justify guardianship. Ryan went beyond ledgers. He located a waiter who remembered a folded paper near the drinks tray and found delivery records for the brand of paper Julian described. Surveillance clips recompiled from different angles revealed a hand movement that matched Julian's description. Footage alone did not prove intent, but paired with messages and payments, it suggested design. Ryan's report became an operational manual. Priority interviews, bank holds to request, and subpoenas to issue. He urged freezing Joel's suspected accounts and obtaining original psychiatric files from Dr. Hinges. If the doctor's notes proved manufactured, there would be grounds for indictment. He explained how he traced shell accounts through patterns of small transfers that aggregated into larger withdrawals. Modest transactions routed through third-party accounts formed a pipeline into Joel's coffers. The timeline of transfers accelerated when Davis and Lauren reported urgent expenses. Arithmetic, not accident. He restored fragments from cloud backups, texts, and archived voicemail, and matched them to bank statements and vendor receipts. Vendors and staff yielded corroboration: a waiter who polished the chipped flute, a chef's inventory discrepancy, and receipts linking Dr. Hinge's invoices to an unmarked LLC. Small pieces form a map. Emotionally, the report landed harder than facts alone. Explicit links between debts and payments made motive difficult to dispute and provided cold context to the hurt. It revealed how love becomes ledger entries when generosity is mistaken for entitlement. Ryan prioritized preservation. Freeze suspicious accounts, subpoena medical records, secure server backups, and take sworn statements from staff. He recommended civil measures alongside criminal referrals to prevent asset dissipation. Fighting greed required patience to build the case and speed to lock the doors. I sat with the folder and felt a curious steadiness. The report made my anger measurable and my plan actionable. We were no longer guessing at motive. We had documents, witnesses, and a path forward. George would file preservation orders, Ryan would trace transfers. I would supply archives. The personal cost remained, estrangement and sorrow. But with evidence in hand, sorrow could be translated into justice and inevitable consequence now. I invited him to lunch like a man extending a last polite gesture before closing a book. I called Davis with the tired tone of a father who had been bruised by expectations. "Come to the club," I said. "Let's talk about retirement." He arrived eager, his smile brittle with the hope that legacy was owed rather than earned. The lunch was designed for optics, a quiet room, sunlight on a table, and the decoy packet George had prepared lying in a neat folder. We ran through old stories before I steered the conversation toward care and future arrangements. Davis offered practiced sympathy. He mentioned Brookville Homes as if it were sensible. "You deserve comfortable care, Dad." He reached for the power of attorney packet. The bait looked authentic. My signature, legal language promising control. He did not read clauses about staggered distribution, trustee committees, or revocation triggers George had written to expose misuse. Lauren arrived later, bright and ready to sign the document she believed would make her keeper of my capital. She did not read the fine print. When Davis slid the folder to her, I let the moment stretch. They signed what they thought was consent. They left in private smiles. I sat with George, who confirmed our hypothesis. They would attempt to use the document to access accounts. The decoy would reveal intent when they tried. The real holdings were behind the trusts. In days that followed, their behavior changed. Lauren asked about arranging an assessment and mentioned moving heirlooms. Davis made whispered comments about finishing arrangements. Ryan monitored and logged their activity. Attempts to access accounts, coordinated communications, and calls about Brookville Homes. A misstep accelerated their exposure. Lauren contacted a paralegal to validate the power of attorney paperwork. The paralegal asked for chain of title details. When custodial records did not match the account numbers on the decoy, alarms rang. Desperation had assumed speed could mask legitimacy. Instead, it revealed inconsistency. Their reaction betrayed them. Davis called in a panicked voice demanding explanations. Lauren's texts grew frantic and less curated. Their calm frayed into contradictions. The bait had nudged them from intention into visible acts. I did not relish luring my son. It felt like a necessary cruelty. A father's duty is to protect, even when that protection requires stern measures. The decoy was meant not merely to entrap but to reveal what had been hidden in late-night messages and whispered plans. When generosity becomes entitlement, love is repurposed into leverage. The trap returned those lines to clarity. Ryan's logs were precise, attempted logins, timestamps of emails, IP addresses used when Lauren contacted the paralegal, and metadata from uploaded documents. He stitched vendors' notes and the paralegal's queries into the timeline. George filed preservation orders while the paralegal's query remained active. We arranged discrete protections for Amy and Rain. Education deposits moved into revocable trusts and support set up to avoid public entanglement. Justice should not punish grandchildren for parental avarice. With the decoy activated, George filed motions to freeze accounts and to compel records from custodians. We issued subpoenas for Dr. Hinge's billing and for Joel's corporate transfers. A forensic accountant began mapping flows that suggested how funds might be siphoned. Watching the documents compile was solace and sorrow. Evidence clarifies. It does not heal. Protecting independence cost intimacy, but autonomy is dignity, and I refuse to relinquish it. When Davis's calls turned insistent and Lauren's texts unraveled, the house felt like a courtroom on the verge of testimony. Their panic had made them conspicuous. The trap worked because it turned intention into traceable acts, and strategy converts motive into proof. The scene was set for the next act, proving the poison's presence in the glass and connecting it to the plan. No. The glass told the truth when words would not. Detective Morris Rubin arrived like a clean question at the end of a long paragraph. He was an even-tempered man who treated crimes as arithmetic before drama. He listened to our presentation, glanced at Julian's hospital chart, and requested the champagne flute for analysis. When he asked for it to be sent to the lab, I felt the gravity of formal inquiry settle like a seal. The lab worked methodically and rendered a clear verdict. Sodium cyanide present in fluid taken from the chipped flute. The chemistry matched Julian's toxicology. Sodium cyanide is a clinical phrase that carries consequences. The report translated suspicion into scientific fact. Rubin photographed the chipped rim, documented handling, and ensured strict chain of custody protocols. I had insisted on preserving the physical items. A broken chain invites dismissal. Rubin's respect for procedure was reassuring. He cross-referenced the lab's findings with Ryan's financial report and George's filings. Motive and means converged. The insurance application, payments to Dr. Desmond Hinges, and transfers to Joel Albert's accounts aligned with the toxicology in a way that suggested intent. Forensic chemistry supplied the body. Documents supplied the motive. Lauren's reaction in the interview room was a study in staged outrage. "Why would I poison my mother?" she demanded, a line that landed like a lie. Davis shuffled at the edge, his phone records now a public ledger of late-night coordination. Rubin presented a timeline showing the flute intended for me had the highest concentration. He explained how small quantities could incapacitate quickly, and how Julian's minimal sip had likely prevented my death. Cyanide acts fast but leaves detectable traces. Duplicate tests at accredited labs were ordered to ensure robustness. We compiled chain of custody logs, photographed evidence, and obtained time-stamped lab receipts. Ryan's restored messages and vendor receipts now sat beside chemistry reports. George coordinated with the district attorney to prepare the motions necessary for warrants. The interplay of legal timing and scientific validation is delicate. Seek a warrant too soon and risk failure. Wait too long and evidence can vanish. When the lab confirmed cyanide, the motive Ryan had reconstructed took on new force. Joel's transfers and the insurance policy read as part of a plan rather than coincidence. Science supplied cause. Documents supplied context. Arrests were executed at dawn. Officers moved on the house and Joel's office with orders to secure devices and records. They cataloged files and removed servers. The operation was clinical. Officials sought to minimize spectacle and preserve evidence. The precinct executed warrants. Lauren for attempted murder and conspiracy, Joel for conspiracy and theft, and steps were taken to freeze accounts. Seeing Davis led away in cuffs was a grief that felt like arithmetic, a sum of choices reducing a son to statistics. I mourned what we had lost even as I accepted the necessity of consequence. Justice demands evidence, and we had supplied it. Practical work followed, notifying trustees, alerting insurers, and securing funds for Julian's care and the grandchildren. The chipped flute I had switched that night, my small deliberate act, sat in a safe as relic and proof. Its rim was a forensic anchor tying a social ritual to a criminal act. That night, in Loretta's rose garden, the air tasted of iron and roses. The law had moved. The hard work of proof had begun truly. Betrayal had been exposed, and greed had been given a ledger. There would be trials and testimony, but the first structural step toward accountability had been taken. Independence, the stubborn currency of my life, had been defended by patient procedure and precise evidence. I invited them into my library like a man opening a ledger he knew to be unbalanced. The room smelled of old paper and lemon oil. The sun slanted through the blinds and cut the dust into thin gold lines. Davis arrived first, hand in pocket, the practiced smile of a man who had expected inheritance as easily as breathing. Lauren followed, composed but bright, the sort of brightness that masks calculation. I closed the door and sat with a calm I had earned over decades in rooms where other men tried to take what was not theirs. I laid the decoy power of attorney on the table and watched their eyes. They read the document as if it were an entitlement, the signatures like a key. "This will make everything simple," Davis said, voice smooth. He did not know the document was a trap. George had drafted clauses so the paper looked generous while opening only a $1,000 window. The bait was not cruelty. It was a demonstration. You cannot prove intent on hopes. You need action. I told them plainly what I had seen at the party. I described the chipped rim, the way Lauren's hand had reached for that particular flute, and the taste Julian had reported. I said what everyone had suspected but had been too polite to voice. I saw her put something into my glass. The confession in my mouth was juridical in tone. Confession without evidence is theater. Confession with corroboration is the beginning of legal consequence. They reacted badly. Lauren's face shifted from color to blank alarm. "I would never," she said, the line brittle. Davis's jaw worked. He tried to say he did not know that she had acted on her own. But texts recovered by Ryan showed planning. Mentions of tomorrow night, references to Brookville homes, and urgency about money. The digital ledger does not have mercy. It admits only patterns. I produced the financial map. Credit card debt, mortgaged home, failed businesses, and $500,000 I had given over 5 years. I explained the insurance policy Lauren had arranged in my name. At that point, the conversation stopped being about family and became arithmetic. Money makes motives legible. Numbers do not apologize. Davis pleaded, then tried bargaining. He asked for mercy in language that betrayed entitlement. He wanted the same life but without effort. I felt a crushing fatigue. This was not solely legal theater. It was the end of a relationship. When a son moves from needing a father to needing an inheritance, the dynamic changes irreparably. I told him, "You made this choice," and felt that sentence weigh on both of. I had no desire to humiliate. I wanted truth. So I handed them Ryan's timeline and the evidence George had arranged. Bank transfers, Dr. Hinge's invoices, Joel's suspicious wire histories. The stack of paper was an indictment beside our chairs. They read in silence, the rustle of pages loud in the quiet room. Lauren tried to invent reasons. Debts, pressure, a moment of irrationality. Davis reached for explanations about desperation. But desperation is not a license to turn family into ledger entries. When greed calcifies, it reduces people to sums and lines on a balance sheet. I watched their faces shift as the arithmetic became clearer. Their final reaction was a mix of shock and calculation. They had believed my willingness to give made them heirs. They had not accounted for my refusal to let greed steal my autonomy. I sat with the sadness of a man who had to choose justice over family. The choice cost me a son and a long line of memories, but it preserved my independence. When they left, Davis looked back as if he expected a reprieve. There was none. The law and the ledger would now do the work of consequence, and I would watch the legal apparatus unfold. The confrontation was a crude, necessary act. Expose motive, produce evidence, and let justice take its course. I had set a trap to save what I cherished, control, dignity, and the quiet life I had fought to secure. I remember the moment I realized this confrontation would not heal anything. There is a particular quiet that follows the shattering of assumptions, the clatter of illusions settling into dust. I had imagined reconciliation in other times, but this exposure of intent made reconciliation impossible. A ledger of actions had replaced family stories. After they left, I called George and told him we needed preservation orders, subpoenas for phone records, and a freeze on suspicious accounts. George said, "We have probable cause," and the words felt like a hinge closing on a long door of uncertainty. At the same time I grieved, a son led away by choices, small domestic affections now taxed by consequence. There is no pleasure in watching consequence arrive. I had given them what I could when they were young. I had not expected gratitude to calcify into entitlement. Yet preserving one's independence is also a moral act. It protects dignity. I resolved then to let the law do its work and to guard the grandchildren from the spectacle. Amy and Rain would have funds for school and protection from public humiliation. The confrontation closed one chapter and opened the meticulous work of proving the rest. I prepared for testimony, calendars of hearings, and the slow, exacting work of accountability and endurance. The courtroom smells of disinfectant and fear. I have sat in many rooms where power is negotiated, but courts have a unique clarity. I arrived early on the first day with George, Ryan, and Julian. The judge's bench rose like a stage and the jurors' faces were blank slates waiting for narration. Lauren sat at the defense table with a practiced look of indignation. Davis looked hollow and small. Joel Albert had arrived in a suit that tried too hard to be ordinary. The prosecution was methodical. Papers, witnesses, timelines, and the lab's toxicology report that had translated suspicion into demonstrable cause. Julian took the stand and the room shifted. She recounted the party with a voice that trembled only when the memory demanded it. It tasted bitter, she said, and the single sentence landed like a bell. Her testimony was simple. She had seen Lauren approach the drinks, she described the folded paper, the powdered residue, and the sequence that led to her collapse. She did not speak of motive, she spoke of what happened. But motive arrived in small details. The folded paper, the chipped rim, the way Loretta's past poisoning attempt folded into the present. Two testimonies that converged created momentum. And the jury felt it. Ryan testified next and laid out the financial scaffolding. He walked the jury through transfers and payments, invoices to Dr. Desmond Hinges, and the insurance policy that read like motive on paper. He showed the recovered texts and the shell account transfers that threaded payments to Joel Albert. His testimony was forensic in tone. He let the numbers speak and did not overreach into rhetoric. The ledger was cruel in its honesty. The defense tried to poke holes. They questioned chain of custody, argued about alternate explanations for trace chemicals, and insinuated coincidence. George answered with quiet competence, teaching the jury the proper meaning of procedures and the importance of protocols. Chain of custody, he told the jury, is not a buzzword. It is the backbone that allows science to answer questions in law. He explained how every sample had a documented path from our house to the lab. In cross-examination, Lauren's composure frayed. Under oath, she had to explain the insurance she had taken out and the messages recovered on her phone. The defense attempted to paint Julian as unreliable, but Ryan's corroborated vendor receipts and camera footage supported her memory. The courtroom is a place where small truths, when repeated and corroborated, accumulate into convincing narrative. Some moments felt more like theater than law. Joel's counsel suggested that his transfers had been innocuous business payments. Ryan's paper trail made that claim thin. The prosecutor asked the jury to compare a life insurance policy, financial desperation, and a psychiatric report bought for convenience as circumstances unlikely to be coincidental. The judge instructed the jury to focus on evidence, not moral supposition, but in the margins where jurors live, motive is often the air they breathe. I sat and watched, feeling an odd detachment. I had always been a man of action, of ledgers and decisions, and watching legal procedure felt like watching a slow, inevitable machine do its work. Friends sat in the gallery. Julian's seat was full of someone who had nearly died and returned to testify, and my son sat with the visible ache of someone whose choices had collapsed his life into a sequence of files and testimony. The trial lasted weeks. Witnesses layered, lab technicians explained cyanide detection, a chemist testified about residue consistent with sodium cyanide, the waiter described the drink's cart rotation, and the private chef testified about inventory. Each witness did the quiet work of translation, turning physical evidence and financial records into a narrative that the jury could read as cause and effect. The prosecution emphasized pattern over passion, and that was its strength. Greed leaves traces. The payments, the policy, the texts. The defense could argue about interpretations, but patterns are stubborn. When Ryan reconstructed a timeline tying withdrawals to urgent expenses on dates that matched other suspicious acts, the narrative tightened like a noose. The jurors reacted to small human details. Julian's trembling voice, the chef's inventory list, the waiter's recollection of a folded paper. The prosecutor's closing argument was precise. This is not family drama, it is a plan executed, he said, and he threaded motive, means, and opportunity with the lab reports. The defense suggested coincidence and questioned chain of custody, but when the chemist explained sodium cyanide's trace patterns, doubt narrowed. Lauren tried a final plea of remorse that fell thin against the evidence. Davis spoke of his daughters with raw regret. The judge reminded the room that law seeks measured consequence, not vengeance. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud. The courtroom exhaled shock, grim acceptance, and a sense that a public ledger had finally matched private suspicion. The cost felt absolute. Sentencing day arrived like a formal punctuation mark at the end of a painful sentence of my own. I sat in the courtroom, the same bench where the trial had unfolded, and watched as sentences were read aloud. The judge's voice carried the concrete finality of law. 25 years for Lauren on attempted murder, 15 years for Joel's conspiracy and embezzlement, and 7 years for Davis on charges of conspiracy and fraud. Those numbers landed with the quiet thud of consequences meant to deter, not to theatrically gratify. I felt no triumph at the pronouncements. Retribution is a brittle thing. Sentences are public accounting, not catharsis. I had wanted justice to be proportional and procedural, and the judge's rulings aligned with that aim. The state had called for measured penalties. The court obliged within the framework of statutes and precedent. It is odd to feel both vindicated and sorrowful. The two emotions occupied the room in equal measure. Outside the courthouse, cameras clustered as if to document the fall of an industrial myth. Reporters circled and asked the rote questions about motive and family. I answered in tight sentences, refusing theater. Justice has its place, I said, careful with words. We sought the truth. The law decided. My public statements were meant to be succinct. Soundbites distort the legal architecture. The practical consequences unfolded with procedural efficiency. Creditors moved on the family home, and asset reports were compiled. Banks executed liens and auction notices were filed. I was asked in the immediate aftermath whether I intended to help, whether I would bail out a son out of consequence. I said no. Mercy without accountability invites repetition. I would not erase consequence to soothe my own guilt. Instead, I focused on structuring support for innocents. The grandchildren. I set up revocable educational trusts and pledged funds for their tuition and support, with oversight strings designed to shield those resources from parental misdeeds. My objective was to avoid punishing Amy and Rain for choices they did not make while ensuring the adults faced the consequences of their actions. I also finalized the broader distribution of the $68 million. George had prepared contingencies that rerouted significant portions to mental health research, elder protection programs, and a scholarship in Loretta's name. The bulk of the sale would fund causes that confronted the very problems that had been weaponized against me. Exploitation of the elderly, the erosion of trust by family greed, and the lack of mental health resources that make desperation metastasize. The sentencing had ripple effects. Joel's corporate holdings were subject to forensic audits. Colleagues who had profited quietly found their transactions under scrutiny. Davis's conviction meant an end to his social mobility and a forced reckoning with the arithmetic that had driven him. Lauren faced the long term alone with the consequences of a choice that had attempted to convert love into ledger entries. There were further legal motions, appeals that stretched the aftermath into months. Defense counsel filed paperwork. George responded with precedent and depositions. The appeals did not erase sentences but prolonged the administrative process. Each hearing required presence and steady narratives. I learned to treat motions as bureaucratic echoes rather than chances for reversal. Restitution hearings followed. Creditors enforced liens and the family home went to auction. I declined offers to repurchase the property. Mercy without accountability invites repetition. Consequence must be instructive, not merely softened by private means. Davis entered the penal system and adjusted to its slow cadence. I wrote once, offering aid for rehabilitation and clear expectations for restitution and behavior. His reply was brief, words of regret. Lauren's conviction meant years confined. The company initiated forensic audits to repair past lax controls. Amy and Rain weathered the storm with resilience. Scholarships and therapy helped. Amy's acceptance to Northville Medical and Rain's interest in psychology felt like small redemptive arcs. I prioritized revocable education trusts and support to keep their futures intact without absolving parental acts. I used portions of the sale to fund elder protection initiatives, mental health research, and a scholarship in Loretta's name. Redirecting money toward prevention and care felt like honoring what Loretta and I valued: dignity and practical help. Legal consequence had arrived. prevention must follow. Children are often the innocent ledger entries that adult greed forgets to check. When the trial ended and sentences were handed down, my mind turned to Amy and Rain, the small faces that had watched us all argue about inheritance and control. They were not conspirators. They were collateral whose futures I felt responsible for preserving. I had never intended to punish them for their parents' choices. I set up revocable educational trusts with oversight and clear conditions. These were not indulgent gestures. They were legal instruments designed to shield tuition from seizure and to prevent misappropriation. The trusts would fund Northville Medical for Amy and a psychology program for Rain. They included stipulations about access and supervision so no adult could redirect funds for personal use. The documents were deliberate and protective because children deserve constancy even when adults falter. Amy took to her studies with a steadiness that mirrored a practical optimism. She had always been focused, old beyond her years, but law and scandal had stolen pieces of adolescence. Her acceptance to Northville Medical felt like a public rectification, a path restored. She sent me a letter after her first orientation and wrote that the trust had allowed her to breathe without the constant calculation of tuition. Her voice in that letter had both sorrow and determination. Rain, the quieter of the two, found psychology by way of curiosity about people who hurt and those who heal. She enrolled in a program that emphasized trauma-informed care, and her early classes suggested an aptitude for making practical, empathetic connections. She attended therapy and school with support in place so the residual public curiosity would not derail her education. Both girls valued privacy. We respected that. I also established modest, revocable support intended for Davis, an annual annuity of $80,000 that could be revoked in the event of conviction. The sum was meant as a measure of paternal responsibility without romanticizing entitlement. After the conviction, George moved to suspend the annuity and to honor the revocation clause. The legal architecture had been designed for contingencies like this. It functioned as intended. Julian became central to their emotional scaffolding. She would drive the girls to classes when needed and hosted quiet family dinners where we discussed ethics and responsibility, not money. Her podcast, Born from Recovery and Outrage, featured episodes on elder exploitation and practical advice on legal safeguards. The podcast became modestly popular in elder advocacy circles and provided a platform for connecting listeners with resources. It was a small but meaningful public utility. School counselors and therapists were engaged to provide continuity. We set up mentorship opportunities for the girls. Sympathetic professionals and community members offered guidance without sensationalism. The goal was not to erase the scandal but to ensure the grandchildren could develop agency independent of their parents' choices. This felt like a moral obligation more than a legal one, a duty to the future for which I had some control. There were local murmurs that I was being indulgent toward my grandchildren while severe with my son. That critique missed a subtlety. Protecting the young is not the same as absolving the guilty. The trusts and annuities were calibrated to balance care and accountability. They preserved dignity for Amy and Rain while ensuring legal repercussions for those who abused familial trust. I took a hands-on approach to the oversight committee for the educational trusts, including an external fiduciary, a counselor, and a community elder to ensure distributions were purposeful. This governance prevented any single person from redirecting funds and created a democracy around the girls' futures. A civic lesson that money without accountability can corrupt intent. Julian's podcast spurred local interest. Callers shared stories of exploitation, and we partnered with an elder advocacy group to distribute practical pamphlets. My donations seeded scholarships and a research grant into elder exploitation and mental health intersections. The work felt less like punishment and more like structural prevention. On quiet evenings, I watched the girls step toward their studies and felt a cautious pride. Resilience is understated in youth. It shows in small continuities that allow someone to rise after public bruising. Their lives offered a promise that betrayal need not become inheritance. I kept watch over their futures with deliberate tenderness. At sunset, I walk where Loretta's roses bloom and measure my life in the faint smell of their petals. The garden is a small ledger of seasons. Roses pruned at winter, bulbs planted, soil turned by people who knew care. There is a fragility to gardens that I find honest, deliberate maintenance, patience, and the acceptance that beauty requires work. At 75, my body moves slower, but my mind keeps a keen register of what matters. Dignity, independence, and the quiet rituals of a life I chose to preserve. After the trial and the sentences, life narrowed to essentials. Fortify assets, protect grandchildren, and translate pain into prevention. I found a strange peace in structure. The trusts George had drawn, the security upgrades, and the podcasts Julian produced formed a new architecture for meaning. Those measures were legal and practical, but they were also moral. Choices made to prevent future harms and to channel wealth toward good causes. I spoke at a symposium on elder protection, where I presented a paper on legal safeguards and the psychology of familial entitlement. My remarks were less about vengeance and more about how systems can be designed to deter exploitation. I argued that preservation of independence is a civic concern and that community institutions should support families in establishing guardrails before greed metastasizes. In private, I kept the chipped flute locked in a safe, a small relic and a crucial piece of evidence. The glass is both memory and instrument. It marks the moment a family could have been ruined and records the seam where my caution cut luck from design. It sits under glass now, sealed, photographed, and catalogued, and I sometimes look at it like one might examine a ledger entry for a costly lesson. The podcast Julian and I co-hosted became more than a narrative. It became resource. Callers sent stories and asked for practical advice. Legal clinics reached out and volunteers offered pro bono counsel. The money I redirected helped support these clinics and seeded a small research fund focused on elder financial abuse. I wanted to ensure that others had the chance to make different choices when faced with the arithmetic of desperation and entitlement. People often ask me whether I regret pursuing legal consequence against my son. Regret is a shape that slides under many doors. I regret the loss of intimacy but not the choice to set boundaries. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are the grammar of self-determination. You can call that independence. Others call it sternness. I call it stewardship of a life that I will not let be cannibalized. Walking among Loretta's roses, I thought of the irony that love had once edged toward poison, and yet it also became the reason I fortified my life against future harm. Forgiveness for Loretta had been private. The protections I installed afterward were public. In a strange arithmetic, mercy remained separate from systems. I could forgive and still insist on safeguards. I met with Amy and Rain at times, often with tea, and we talked about small practicalities and larger responsibility. They were not curiosities to be managed. They were young people with ambitions and scars. We discussed independence. How the ability to care for yourself requires systems and choices that prioritize dignity over entitlement. We spoke of resilience and what it means to rebuild when trust fractures. There were days when the weight of what had been done settled heavily. I missed my son in a way that grief does not always permit. Longing for the boy who had once learned to mend a car battery and the man I hoped he could be. The law does not teach kindness. It enforces consequences. I accepted that my role was to protect what remained and to use resources to make the world marginally safer for others. On the anniversary of the sale, I planted a new rosebush in Loretta's bed. It felt symbolic and practical at once. Growth after rupture. I attended a small community forum where Julian spoke about legal warning signs and where survivors shared their stories. The work continued. Prevention rarely concludes with a single act. My life is quieter now. I measure days in small rituals. The chef's morning tea, a walk before noon, correspondence with trustees. I keep the flute locked, the trusts executed, and the podcast episodes archived. Control, once a word tangled with money, has become the vocabulary of dignity. I use resources to fund scholarship, therapy, and clinics that might avert the ledger of greed in other families. Sometimes visitors ask what I would say to those tempted by greed. I tell them this plainly. Greed disguises itself as need and uses family as ledger entries. If you suspect exploitation, document, seek counsel, and build systems before desperation turns love into tragedy. Money without control corrupts. Money with oversight protects. My life's last work is to translate my misfortune into guidance so others might avoid the arithmetic that once almost cost me everything, and hold fast to dignity. I have lived long enough to know that betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those you once held closest. I tasted the bitterness of poison, not from a stranger's hand, but from within my own family. I watched greed blind a son, and I felt the sting of a daughter-in-law's ambition. Yet through all of it, I clung to my independence, fought for justice, and built resilience from the ashes of betrayal. But I wonder, what would independence mean to you if your own blood tried to strip it away? How do you define greed when generosity is twisted into entitlement? When family becomes the source of betrayal, what should justice look like? Punishment, forgiveness, or protection against further harm? And when life forces you into battles you never sought, how do you shape resilience without becoming hardened and bitter? I ask you now, not as a man who survived, but as someone who wants to hear your truth. What do dignity, control, family betrayal, justice, money, inheritance, and resilience truly mean to you? Share your perspective, your lessons, and your take on this story. Because in the end, how we define these words shapes not just our lives, but the legacy we leave behind.